Thank you to the Centre and indeed to Mary for inviting me, albeit that Mary is, as you said, doing field work. It's a real thrill and a real privilege to be able to give this seminar, not least because of the 50 minutes of time that I have to present my research. I must admit to no longer being very used to having such a long period of time to myself. Hopefully I haven't lost the knack and will be able to keep you captivated for the entire time. It's 50 to 54 minutes, depending on what I forget. And what I'm going to be presenting to you today is an argument drawn from a chapter that's part of an edited collection that tried to trace the links between inequality, crime, punishment, and politics. It's an edited collection edited by Nikki Lacey, David Soskis, Leonidas Kiliotis, and Safok Xenakis, and it brings together contributions that were made at a British Academy conference of the same name and in the light of reflections from that conference. And the argument that I make in the paper and that I'm going to make today is that where we are interested in tracing these links, it might be worthwhile paying renewed attention to contemporary ideologies, contemporary thin ideologies, to use Friedman's terminology. And I'm going to be working today with the categories developed by Nadia Urbinati: populism, episteme, and plebiscitarianism. And the reason why I think that the punishment society scholarship writ large ought to pay attention to these ideologies is that they have the potential to engender and sustain incentives for punitiveness. And I will explain how in the course of my talk. But before I get to the substance of the argument, I think it might be helpful to give you some idea of what my research is more broadly and where this paper fits in my broader research. So in my case, for the last decade, I've been working within the punishment and society scholarship, trying to grapple, as many have done, with what we could call the problem of punitiveness. So punitiveness, as you will know, is of course a term that we use for better or for worse to indicate the fact that from about the 1970s through to the present day, give or take a few years, a number of Western democracies have experienced increasing incarceration rates, where these incarceration rates had no obvious relationship to crime rates. What is more, this quantitative shift is thought to be the symptom of a qualitative shift in punishment, away from punishment as rehabilitation and towards punishment as retribution, but where retribution is really articulated as vengeance and incapacitation as social banishment. And this is a problem, hence the problem of punitiveness, both on its own terms, in terms of the human cost of this increasing and increasingly harsh punishment, but also because there is a sense in the punishment and society literature in which we link punishment and democracy. So punishment can be a litmus paper for the well-being of our democracies. We think that a democracy that is strong is capable of responding to the violation of its rules in a manner that makes a parsimonious use of state coercion, and that whilst respecting or whilst reaffirming its norms is nonetheless capable of doing so whilst respecting the human dignity of the offender. Consequently, increasing use of increasingly harsh punishment suggests that all is not well with the state of our democracies, which means that people have consequently tried to understand what the roots of this punitiveness were, amongst other things, to try and forestall its expansion or even reverse it, and therefore in some way also address the problem of democracy that punitiveness is thought to represent. Within this body of scholarship, there is now a very strong comparative sort of subset of theories, for example, the work of Nikki Lacey, and this is where I would also set my research. And if you like, the comparative scholarship in this field has responded to the problem of punitiveness with the hope of moderation, in the sense that one of its main observations is that there isn't, in fact, collective convergence around punitiveness. And this is true both at the level of its penal expression, but also in terms of some of the root causes that we think have led to punitiveness. We actually face penal divergence looking even just across European nations, which is really the main sort of group of countries that I'm interested in. So here the scholarship doesn't just look at the roots of punitiveness, but also at the roots of resistance to punitiveness, and also the roots of moderation. The two are not exactly the same thing. My work is set within this second branch of scholarship. It's not strictly speaking comparative, but I work with what Lappi Seppälä has called a country-specific deviation, where my specific country is Italy, and it deviates from this punitive blueprint, which is set out as universal, but is in fact much more contextual. And the way Italy deviates from the punitive blueprint is that it's not unequivocally punitive. Unfortunately, it's also not unequivocally moderate. In Italy, what we see is an alternation between punitiveness and moderation. So I've characterized Italian penality as a dual penalty precisely because of this alternation. And we also find that punitiveness and moderation are differentially distributed in Italy. Now, this alternation, this coexistence and alternation of punitiveness and moderation, you can see even just looking at Italian incarceration rates. So from about 1970 through to today, what we've seen is a background increase in incarceration. I think in 1970, Italian incarceration rates were around 40 per 100,000. Latest World Prison Brief data set the incarceration rate at 91 per 100,000. But this background increase is not linear. It's marked by a series of routine deflations of the prison population that were given, at least until the 1990s, by a routine use of amnesties and pardons, so clemency provisions. After 1990, these clemency provisions fell out of favor. I think we had just one in 2006. But even after 2006 and more recently, what we've seen is a drop in incarceration rates given by decarceration provisions. So provisions very explicitly geared at reducing Italian incarceration rates and therefore Italian rates of overcrowding, which have been found to violate both Italian constitutional rules and indeed European human rights standards. So we have here this oscillation between punitiveness and moderation that really is a broader feature of Italian penal history. And also, as I was saying before, punitiveness and moderation are differentially distributed, meaning that not everyone is equally likely to be subject to the punitive majesty of the Italian state, nor is everyone equally likely to be able to tap into the sources of moderation that we find in Italy, for example, its informal social controls. And this differentiation happens across a number of lines. One of the most notable ones is, of course, that between nationals and non-nationals. Think here of the work of Dario Melossi. And non-national, so non-EU migrants and also EU accession state migrants have emerged as, if you like, Italy's preferred penal subject, more likely to be subject to any Italian punitiveness than nationals. So in this regard, Italy is an interesting case study. And what my research does with this case study is try and set up a conversation between Italy and its specifics and the extant penal theories that I work with. And I, in particular, work within the political economy of punishment, but also with analyses that have linked punitiveness and moderation to different political institutional setups. And I try and shuttle between my case study and these theories, trying to craft as nuanced a picture as possible of the Italian penal system, but then wiser by the insights drawn from the case study, I try and sort of modify some of the claims or reflect upon the claims that are made within broader punishment and society scholarship. And as I was preparing for the seminar, I realized that this is not the only conversation that my research tries to undertake. Another one is between different theories from within the punishment and society literature that may have developed on even very close parallel tracks without necessarily crisscrossing, if nothing else, because there's a division of labor in our field. We can't all research everything at the same time. So, for example, in this paper, I try and bring together the political institutionalist's account of the political economy of punishment that we find in Nikki Lacey's work in The Prisoner's Dilemma, for example, but also the work done by Loder and Sparks, that links political ideologies to what they call a better politics of crime. So really trying to bring these insights together. And finally, I think the hardest conversation that my work tries to undertake is between penology and domain fields. For example, the political economy proper, which is of interest if you do the political economy of punishment, even though that's an especially difficult conversation. In this paper, however, I draw more explicitly on theories that have been put forward in political theory and political sociology proper that are also concerned with the crisis of representative democracy. So of interest where penology has linked the crisis of democracy and punishment. And what I'm going to be doing the rest of this presentation is synthesizing these conversations to create what is hopefully a coherent argument and convince you of the fact that punishment and society scholarship should be paying attention to these contemporary thin political ideologies. And it should be paying attention to these ideologies because they have, as I was saying before, the capacity to engender and sustain punitive incentives, amongst other reasons, because these are all ideologies that have ambitions for institutional reform. So in the punishment and society scholarship, one of the lines of inquiry has connected both punitiveness and moderation to institutional differences, as I will explain in a second. Well, these ideologies all have ambitions for institutional reform. And these three ideologies, these thin ideologies, have been gaining increasing traction in Western democracies. And what we've seen is that where we've had political formations motivated entirely or in part by one or more of these ideologies, they've really pushed for institutional reform. Institutional reform in particular that is premised on a very disintermediated, fast-paced, decisionist approach to politics. Why is this of concern to the punishment and society scholarship? Well, here we need to look at those analyses that have linked political institutions and punitiveness and moderation. So Nikki Lacey's work, but also Aaron Leiphart's claims, and also Vanessa Barker's work on sort of comparative penal divergences in the US. And one of the claims that this literature puts forward, one of its observations, is that where political institutional structures are premised on negotiation and consensus and an interdependence of political actors, this has tended to act as a buffer to punitiveness. And in its best articulation, it's also created incentives towards a more moderate approach to punishment. By contrast, where the political institutionalist structure is more majoritarian, so more subject to policy volatility and to what we could call a kind of lone wolf approach to policy making, well, this particular institutional structure offers few buffers to punitive incentives, to punitiveness. And the typical example given of these institutional differences is the difference at the level of the electoral system. So systems that function on the back of proportional representation, which will yield government coalitions, tend to incentivize a politics premised on negotiation and consensus. Majoritarian first past the post electoral systems tend to incentivize, by contrast, a much more sort of volatile approach to policy with shorter term policy horizons. How is this thought to work? How can we reconnect these institutional differences to differences in punishment? Well, we can look, for example, at the effect that they might have at the level of penal policy. So imagine that you have a polity where there are some popular demands for punishment, for harsher punishment, but it's a system that's based on negotiation and consensus. So before these popular demands for punishment can become penal policy, they will have to pass through these levels of negotiation and consensus. And at each level, their punitive impetus might be diffused or diluted, so that by the time that we get to penal policy, we don't have this direct conduit to punitiveness to policy. This is not the case in systems where, sort of majoritarian systems, where there may be a much more direct conduit between sort of punitive demands and penal policy, particularly if political executives see the electoral value in exploiting any such demands for punitiveness. So here, in a sense, the institutionalist account of penal divergence do set out this hope for moderation. Some nations, given their institutions, have been able to resist the impetus towards greater punitiveness. And this is where I sound a note of caution, because, as I've been saying before, we are in the presence of political ideologies that are gaining traction, that have a distinct agenda for institutional reform, that runs directly counter to this idea of an institutional setup premised on political mediation, negotiation, and consensus. These are institutions that are, by and large, really inimical to the kind of political procedures that we associate with party democracy. And here, I think I'd like to sit a little with these ideologies and explain the categories to you. As I said before, I build here on Nadia Urbinati's work in a 2015 monograph, Democracy Disfigured. And she has these three disfigurements of democracy: episteme, populism, and plebiscitarianism. She doesn't actually call them political ideologies, so I think that they can be seen as political ideologies. Political ideologies understood, channeling Frieden as sort of repertoires of meaning and understanding that allow us to understand the world, ourselves in the world, and ourselves as political agents. She doesn't cast them as these, she casts them as theoretical possibilities in really existing realities, so really existing phenomena. But as I say, I'm going to use them as ideologies. And the way in which they disfigure democracy in her account is that they upset what is the constitutive balance in fully functioning representative democracies between will and opinion. And will refers to the right to vote and the procedures of decision-making, from what I understand of Urbinati, and opinion is the extra-institutional domain of public opinion. And in the ideal version of representative democracy, they are both an integral part of the functioning of democracy. They influence one another, but they are in balance. So opinion doesn't cannibalize will, and will doesn't cannibalize opinion. What the three disfigurements of democracy do is they upset this constitutive balance. So I think in episteme, you have will overtaking opinion, and in populism and plebiscitarianism, you have opinion overtaking will. How else does Nadia Urbinati characterize these three disfigurements? And it's here that her work is really of interest to me. Well, so when she characterizes episteme, she says epistemic theory, of which technocracy is a prime example, proposes to depoliticize democratic procedures and make them procedures to achieve correct outcomes. The aim of episteme is to, again in her words, rescue democracy from its partisanship and make it an expression of the power of knowledge. So here we have the idea, we can understand this by thinking of what makes a good decision in an epistemic system. And what makes a good decision is not, or what makes a valid decision rather, and what makes a valid decision is the fact that it is a good decision, not the fact that it is a legitimate decision. So the emphasis is not on a decision, a political decision having followed the correct procedure, it's actually on its substance. And it will only be valid if it is good, substantively, and in episteme, it tends to be good if it coheres with the knowledge of experts. So that's episteme. Its counterpart, or in fact, in more recent developments, it's been seen as one head of a sort of two-headed political monster that is technopopulism. Its other side, the sort of the mirror image of episteme, is populism. Again, to build on Urbinati, populism features the citizen as a member of a we, whose unity some leaders concoct as hegemonic opinion that claims that it speaks for the will of the whole. So we have a we, the people, that is conflated, collapsed into the will of the majority, and it's this will of the majority that is the norm of true representation. Again, here, decisions are valid if they are good, not if they are legitimate, but here they are good if they cohere with the will of we, the people, this homogeneous bloc. Then we have plebiscitarianism, and I must admit, of the three categories, it's the one that I find hardest to explain, but also coming from the Italian context, as indeed Nadia Urbinati is also reflecting on it, the Italian context, it does have some intuitive appeal. In plebiscitarianism, or the essence of plebiscitarianism, is the spectacle of leadership. The visual, it's a sort of a business of visual attendance, and the citizenry are cast as a passive applauding audience, applauding their visible leader. If you consider that Italy was for decades led by Berlusconi, who was a media mogul as well as an entrepreneur and a politician, you can see why plebiscitarianism does have some intuitive sense. It often overlaps with populism, but there is this emphasis on the visibility of the leader. Aside from the specifics of these three categories, what is of interest, and what is of interest to me, is the fact that the sort of common denominator of all these three democratic disfigurements is their real sort of enmity to party politics, so to the mediation of political conflict, to parliamentary procedures, and also to the temporal dimension of these parliamentary procedures. So the fact that decisions may take a long time, which is why they push for a much more disintermediated, direct politics. They talk about, there's a sense in which they want to get rid of the middleman, where the middleman is, for example, the MP, or in essence, the party politician. And the reason why they push for this sort of disintermediated politics is that they are vulnerable to political conflict. They are incapable, because of their internal logic, of being able to institutionalize political conflict within their workings. And this is because the source of authority in all three of these disfigurements is absolute. So in populism and in episteme, the source of authority is truth, be it the truth of the experts or the truth of the people. In plebiscitarianism, the source of authority is faith, faith in the leader. Truth and faith are not subject to negotiation. Something is true or it is not. It's non-negotiable. Faith cannot be negotiated. The opposite of faith is heresy. So within their very logic, they find it very difficult to incorporate or even conceive of political conflict as anything other than pathological. What is more, they are all premised on the idea of the citizenry as homogeneous and unanimous. So they require homogeneity and unanimity, the homogeneity and unanimity of the people united behind the knowledge of the experts, the homogeneity and unanimity of the people of populism, and likewise the homogeneity and unanimity of the passive citizens applauding their leader. But of course, reality is neither homogeneous nor unanimous, and political conflict is physiological, not pathological, within our complex society. So faced with this heterogeneous reality, these ideologies to exist and to function tend to artificially impose homogeneity and to excise conflict, for example, through institutional forms that are very much premised on disintermediation, on fast-paced decision-making, on executive decision-making and decisionism. Obviously, I've been leading you to my conclusion, which is so clearly this is of concern, where we pin our hopes of moderation on institutional structures that are premised on negotiation and consensus, because we are in the presence of three ideologies that really militate against this. And consequently, if their institutional ambitions are realized, they have the capacity to knock down what we've considered to be institutional buffers to punitiveness. You might well ask at this point, well, where have we witnessed these ideologies and their institutional ambitions? And this is where I'm going to be drawing upon my case study, and I'm going to be talking to you about specific examples drawn from the Italian context. But I would like to point out that although these are very specifically Italian examples, some of the dynamics that I'm describing echo dynamics that have been observed, for example, by Dawson and DeWitt in their account of how the Eurozone crisis was managed across European institutions and throughout member states. There are also echoes of what I say in sort of Wolfgang Streeck's critique of Angela Merkel's Germany, or Didier Fassin's polemic against Macron's France. So there are at least, I would say, some prima facie similarities. That means that the arguments that I'm making today might be of interest outside the Italian context. But looking specifically at the Italian context. Now, what I'm going to be describing for you are a series of attempted institutional reforms, some attempted, some dormant, and some successful, taken from a series of executives in Italy between the period 2008 and 2020, though really 2019. So from the Eurozone crisis to COVID, my account hasn't systematically dealt with COVID at all, although I'd be happy to try and ad-lib some reflections in the Q&A if it were of interest. And across this period of time, across this decade, we've seen in Italy a large number of executives, not all of which we voted for, from a variety of different political that adopt a variety of different political positions. So we go from Mario Monti's government of neoliberal technocrats, explicitly neoliberal technocrats, self-styled as technocrats rather than politicians, all the way to the self-styled populists that gave us our government of change between 2018 and 2019, so the Five Star Movement and the Northern League. And somewhere in the middle were a series of what we could broadly define as some sort of national coalition governments, headed, for example, in the examples that I will be drawing upon, by Matteo Renzi, who was at the time leader of the centre-left Democratic Party. So we have here really politicians of a variety of stripes. But as you will see, their institutional reforms really all have this through line of pushing for a disintermediated politics. So we can start with one of the reforms passed by Matteo Renzi's government in 2015, and it was a reform of Italian electoral law, at least as it applied to the Italian Chamber of Deputies. And this electoral law, known as the Italicum, was a form of proportional representation, but it was a form of proportional representation that relied on a very hefty majority bonus. So the way it worked was that if at the general elections a party were to get more than 40% of the vote, then it would be granted 340 out of 630 seats in parliament. So it had this rather large majority bonus. If no single party managed to get a majority more than 40% of the votes at the elections, you'd have runoff elections between the two most voted parties, and the party that won the runoff election would be able to benefit from the majority bonus. And this majority bonus applied only to parties, not to coalitions. That was very explicit. So if circumstances aligned and we did go to a majority bonus, the result could be that a party that had received no more than 25% of the votes in the first round could have 340 seats in parliament. And the aim of this reform was speedy decision-making and stability and governability at the expense of representativeness. This was very explicit. The idea was to streamline Italian political decision-making, not least to push through those social and economic reforms that were necessary for Italy to sort of pull up its socks and make good on its fiscal duties in Europe. This electoral reform had only a very brief life. 2 years later, the Italian Constitutional Court declared it unconstitutional, and declared it unconstitutional precisely because, specifically as the runoff vote worked, it sacrificed representativeness too much. So it's fine to want to have stability and governability over representativeness, but representativeness can't be so sacrificed as it was under this electoral law. So the electoral law that left a legislative vacuum. It's now been filled with a rather complicated law that's a mixed system, and that's enough said. So as I've said before, this particular electoral reform applied only to the Chamber of Deputies. It didn't apply to the Senate. So Italy has two parliamentary houses, the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, and it's a form of perfect bicameralism in the sense that both houses of parliament have equal powers and both are directly elected. The Senate was to be reformed, and again, Matteo Renzi is the driver of this reform, but it was to be reformed through constitutional reform. And as a result of this constitutional reform, it was supposed to become smaller. It also was not going to be directly elected, and it was supposed to have far fewer powers. Most of the powers would go to the deputies. And again, the philosophy here is ease and speed of decision-making and stability. This particular constitutional reform never saw the light of day. It was rejected by the Italian electorate. As I will be explaining in a minute, in Italy, you have two types of referenda. The majority of referenda that we vote on are repeal referenda, so you strike laws off the books and then it's up to the political class to fill the vacuum. But constitutional reform may sometimes entail a referendum if the constitutional reform hasn't achieved a high enough majority in parliament. And the electorate turned out in droves, I think is the expression, to reject this constitutional reform. Matteo Renzi, in a very plebiscitarian move, had double knotted his fate to this constitutional reform. He had really cast it as a plebiscite for his leadership. And so out he went with the constitutional reform, and he stopped being the prime minister, and now he is no longer a member of the Democratic Party. But lest you think that the impetus towards a disintermediated politics died with Matteo Renzi's executive, let me take you forward to the government of change. In 2018, we went to general elections, and the general elections returned a coalition of two, I would say, unlikely bedfellows, the Five Star Movement and the League. The Five Star Movement is a movement become party. It's founded by polemic comedian Beppe Grillo and internet guru Gianroberto Casaleggio, now taken over by his son. And it can be loosely called sort of a populist party. And to a certain extent, it is self-styled as a populist party. It is anti-ideological and anti-political. It's anti-political in the sense that it really aims to get rid of the political middleman. They see politicians as a caste of corrupt individuals. And it's anti-ideological in the sense that it sets itself out as being beyond left and right. Policy issues are to be resolved on a piecemeal basis, on the basis of common sense, and indeed also expertise, which is why it is, I think, an instance of techno-populism, where often this expertise can derive by being a citizen. So there's a conflation again of populism and technocracy. They are also multi-ideological. This piecemeal approach to policy means that they can draw from left-wing positions and right-wing position. Left-wing is their claim to stand for all those left behind by the social and economic reforms associated broadly with globalization and more specifically with austerity politics. Right-wing is their approach to immigration. And here they converged quite well with the League. Now, the League is the new and improved version of the erstwhile Northern League. The Northern League, some of you may know, was a secessionist party that aimed to break away the productive and rich north of Italy from the lazy south. Under Matteo Salvini's leadership, also a plebiscitarian leader, it's been restyled as a national and indeed nationalistic party. It's very right-wing, it's xenophobic, and it's definitely anti-immigrant. And so this government of change, under this government of change, we had a minister for relations with parliament, which we'd always had, but this minister for relations with parliament was also a minister for relations with parliament and direct democracy. Both parties really pushed this idea of being in favor of direct democracy. To the best of my knowledge, we've never had a minister of direct democracy before then, and we've never had one since, but there we did for this brief period, one Mr. Fraccaro. And one of the reforms that was being pushed by this ministry was a reform of Italian referenda. As I've said before, in Italy, we have constitutional referenda and repeal referenda. But the suggestion made by the government of change was to, again, a constitutional reform, introduce the possibility for initiatives or propositional referenda. The idea behind the law was that it was possible for there to be popular legislative initiatives. If supported by a set number of signatures, these popular legislative initiatives would need to be approved of by Parliament within an 18-month window. If Parliament refused to approve the law or modified it substantially, then the law would be subject to a confirmatory referendum, unless those who proposed the law accepted Parliament's modification. So it set up a kind of contest between Parliament and the people, which in one formulation was to be resolved via a propositional referendum, a confirmatory referendum. In its initial articulation, this propositional referendum would have no quorum. Currently, repeal referenda have a quorum of 50%. This propositional referendum was to have no quorum at all. So whoever turned up to vote, we'd go with what the majority ruled. That's since been modified, and we have a 25% quorum, which is still pretty low compared to the 50% quorum that we're used to. What's also interesting to note is that in this reform, there is potentially no limit to the number of popular legislative initiatives that can be put forward, even though Parliament only ever has 18 months to respond to them. And there are very few limits to the type of subjects that can be covered in these referenda. So there is the idea that they shouldn't cover issues of constitutional sensitivity, but this has been judged to be a pretty vague definition. And the concern is that these referenda may come to touch upon sort of key nodes of the polity's life, including, no surprises for guessing, in a room full of criminologists, criminal law, criminal justice, and criminal procedure. This reform was approved of by the deputies in 2019, and to the best of my knowledge, and I have been on the Italian Parliament's website to check, it's still dormant at the Senate. So it is potentially a dormant reform. We have to wait and see. In 2019, the government of change ended. The League is no longer in power. The Five-Star Movement is currently now ruling under what I would have thought was their sort of anathema, Mario Draghi, so the technocrat par excellence. But last example, what we do have is successful constitutional reform passed in 2020 by a coalition government that also saw the Five-Star Movement within it. And this is a reform of Parliament, and we've reduced the number of seats in Parliament. It hasn't yet come into effect, so it's on the books, but it'll come into effect with the next general election. The Senate now has gone from 315 to 200 seats. The deputies have gone from 630 to 400, again, in the interest of getting rid of the middleman and streamlining procedures. So really, Italy, I think, does give us a portrait of a place where we've seen political formations variously populated by these three ideologies that have very much pushed for the type of institutional reforms premised on disintermediation and fast-paced decision-making. Of course, as I said before, this is of concern where we think that negotiation and consensus, political institutional structures premised on negotiation and consensus, help buffer against punitive excesses. And really I want to, but I think So this is one of the more visible ways in which I think these ideologies have the potential to engender punitive incentives. But they can also do so from a slightly broader perspective, from the perspective of the type of pedagogy that they set up within a nation. So what they teach citizens specifically about the way in which we deal with conflict and those who bring conflict to us. And this is what I'm going to be discussing in the last bit of my presentation. But first, I'm going to get to it in a little bit of a roundabout fashion, again, spending a bit more time with the political institutionalist analysis of punishment. And here I'm going to be channeling the work of Nikki Lacey done with Hannah Pickard, but also, again, Vanessa Barker's work on divergences across US states. And Lacey and Pickard, in their work on blame and forgiveness, have a concept that I find extremely compelling, and it's the notion of associational value. I find it compelling. That doesn't mean I know how to explain it properly, but here goes. So associational value is a concept that refers to group relations, and in particular group relations that have been threatened by what Lacey and Pickard call an aggression. I'm actually going to expand that and call it conflict. So conflict, for example, the conflict created by crime and deviance. An associational value will tell you what the likelihood is of this group responding to the conflict in a manner that emphasizes reconciliation, and so is capable of protecting the social bonds that have been threatened by aggression, and especially allowing them to extend in the future. Or the likelihood of it tells you the likelihood of these conflicts being met with by reconciliation, or by contrast by retaliation so with a reaction therefore that risks rupturing the social bonds for good. Where associational value is high, so where there is value in maintaining the group relations into the future, then we're more likely to find that conflict is dealt with in a manner that is reconciliatory. By contrast, where associational value is low, we're more likely to find these conflicts being met with in a way that is retaliatory. So because there is no incentive to maintaining the group relations in the future in the face of this conflict. We can articulate this in terms of crime and punishment, or rather of punishment. Where associational value is high, then conflict is more likely to be met through informal means of conflict resolution rather than through formal penal censure. And when there is formal penal censure, it's more likely to be rehabilitative rather than retaliatory. So by and large, high associational value incentivizes a more moderate approach to punishment. By contrast, if associational value is low, then the conflict is more likely to be met with formal penal censure, calling in the state and its majesty and its agents to arbiter the conflict. And it's more likely to be arbitered in a manner that emphasizes retaliation, because there is no incentive to maintain these social bonds in the future. So here we have low associational value, incentivizing a more punitive approach to punishment. What Lacey and Pickard tell us is that associational value is a property of interpersonal relations. So kinship or other mutually benefit conferring relations will tend to incentivize high associational value. But what they also tell us that is really key to my argument is that associational value is also a property of institutional setups. Institutional setups that are premised on negotiation and consensus and interdependence of the agents tend to stimulate high associational value and engender in citizens the expectations that associational value is and should be high. By contrast, where institutional structures that are premised on sort of majoritarian, a more lone wolf, volatile approach to politics, they don't have the same effect. They tend to incentivize low associational value. They do not engender the expectation that associational value is and should be high. So here the link is between institutional structures and associational value and punishment. Let's slot in the ideologies that I've been talking about today. Obviously, given how I've presented them to you, these are three ideologies that, given their institutional impetus, do not at the institutional level stimulate high associational value, quite the opposite. But I think this is also, they do so also in a broader fashion, and this is where I want to talk about their potential pedagogical effects on the citizenry. Now here you have to kind of agree with me that ideologies and institutions and political practices, and ideologies especially where they have institutional articulation, have a pedagogic effect on citizens. They teach us, that is, how to be citizens within our polities. And what interests me is the lesson that these ideologies sort of give us, especially on how to deal with conflict, how to understand conflict, deal with conflict, and deal with those who bring conflict to us, so the aggressors or those who trespass against us. First and foremost, political conflict is the concern of these ideologies, but I think they have the capacity to also teach us how to deal with interpersonal conflict. What is the type of pedagogy that these three ideologies set up? Well, as I've said before, these ideologies are ideologies that can only conceive of conflict as pathological and not physiological. What is more, because they are ideologies premised on homogeneity and unanimity, they don't really give us the symbolic tools to understand of conflict in anything other than, as anything other than pathological. And because they are premised on unanimity, they also teach us that those who bring conflict towards us are not our equals, are not our partners in a dialogue, they are enemies. What is more, they are what Nadia Urbinati calls total enemies. By contrast to sort of more sort of ideologies or party politics, where politics or where ideologies are premised on a political dialogue, on mediation, and on the revisability of decision making. So the revisability of our decisions. The revisability of decision and dialogue, I think, are especially important because the revisability of decision teaches us that it is possible to err as humans, that error is possible. But even in the face of error, it may be worth continuing to interact with whoever has erred, whoever has trespassed against us. Not so in populism, plebiscitarianism, and episteme. We are in the presence of total enemies. There is no point negotiating, there is no point mediating. So what do you do in the face of conflict? Well, you banish conflict with any means possible, be they institutional or be they criminal justice concepts. What do you do when you're faced with a total enemy? You certainly don't reconcile, you annihilate. So what I'm arguing is that these ideologies set up what I've called in the paper pedagogy of adversarialism, but what I think is actually better understood as a pedagogy of enmity. And to the extent that these ideologies take hold, and especially where they have institutional manifestations where they're hardly likely to incentivize higher levels of associational value. To go back to Lacey and Pickard's language, quite the contrary. So actually, I'm 10 minutes early. I'll just sum up what I've been trying to convince you of. And the argument that I've been trying to make is that the punishment and society scholarship, where it's interested in this problem of punitiveness and also the hope of moderation, needs to pay renewed attention to these thin political ideologies. Populism, I've been using Nadia Urbinati's category, so again, populism, episteme, and plebiscitarianism, which I think are of interest not only because they are gaining traction within Western democracies, but because they're of interest to the sort of punishment and society literature, because these are ideologies that, first of all, have agendas for institutional reform. They push for a disintermediated approach to politics that has the potential to break down our institutional protection against punitiveness. But also at the level of their pedagogy, they teach us that conflict is a pathology, that enemies are total enemies. And so they incentivize us to respond to conflict and to enemies in a retaliatory fashion, calling upon, if you like, the state's majesty to sort of crush the conflict and annihilate the enemy. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Zelia, and apologies for the delay there. That was really fascinating, super interesting. Thank you so much. And it's great to have a bit of time for questions. So for that time, I'm going to pause the recording and just ask if people could put into the chat that they have a question. That will help me to come to you in order.